What if I told you that on Halloween night 1995, two people walked out of their apartment in Duluth, Minnesota and vanished so completely that it would take nearly 3 decades to discover what really happened to them? What if the answer was hiding in plain sight the entire time, protected by someone the community trusted most? This is the story of Sarah Mitchell and David Romano, a young couple whose disappearance would haunt Duluth for 28 years, and whose case would finally be solved through a combination of advanced technology and one detective's refusal to give up on the truth. If you're drawn to cases where the truth hides behind familiar faces, hit that subscribe button now, because this investigation will change how you think about trust in small communities forever. October 31, 1995 arrived in Duluth with the kind of crisp autumn air that made every breath feel clean and sharp. The maple trees lining East Superior Street had reached their peak, painting the quiet neighborhood in shades of amber and gold that seemed almost too perfect for what was about to unfold. Sarah Mitchell stood at her second-floor apartment window, watching children in costumes hurry past on the sidewalk below. At 26, Sarah had the kind of genuine warmth that drew people to her without effort. Her auburn hair caught the late afternoon light as she moved around the small kitchen, arranging bowls of candy for trick-or-treaters. She hummed softly while she worked, occasionally glancing toward the bathroom where running water suggested her boyfriend David was getting ready for their quiet Halloween evening together. They had planned nothing elaborate, just a walk through the neighborhood to see decorations, maybe stopping at the local diner for coffee afterward. David Romano emerged 20 minutes later, his dark hair still damp, wearing the flannel shirt and jeans that had become his uniform during his 6 months in Duluth. At 28, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. Though he had only recently moved from Chicago to take a job at the paper mill, the relationship with Sarah was still new enough to feel electric, still in that stage where every shared glance felt significant. The apartment itself told the story of two lives slowly becoming one. Sarah's books mixed with David's vinyl records on the shelves, her house plants thriving next to his collection of vintage cameras. Outside, streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the residential streets where families were settling in for the evening. At exactly 7:15, Sarah grabbed her denim jacket from the hook by the door while David jingled his car keys, a simple gesture that would later be analyzed by investigators trying to piece together their final movements. The red Toyota Camry waited in the parking lot behind the apartment building, its paint slightly faded but reliable. Sarah had teased David about the car when they first met, calling it dependably boring, but tonight she climbed into the passenger seat with the easy familiarity of someone who had made the same journey dozens of times. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, who lived directly below Sarah's apartment, later told police she heard their footsteps on the stairs at 7:25, followed by car doors closing and an engine starting. What she remembered most clearly, what would haunt her for years, was the sound of their laughter drifting up from the parking lot, carefree and bright in the gathering dusk. It was the kind of laughter that spoke of inside jokes and shared secrets, of two people who believed they had all the time in the world to build something beautiful together. That laughter would be the last sound anyone would definitively connect to Sarah Mitchell and David Romano as they lived and breathed. The last confirmed sighting came from Jimmy Kowalski, walking his German Shepherd near the intersection of East Superior and 15th Avenue. He waved at the couple as they drove past, noting how Sarah had her window rolled down despite the cool evening air, her hair dancing in the breeze as she turned to say something that made David smile. By 8:30 that evening, according to witnesses at Benny's Diner, a couple matching their description had ordered coffee and apple pie. The waitress remembered the woman's laugh and the man's habit of drinking his coffee black. But she couldn't be absolutely certain it was Sarah and David, and more importantly, she never saw them leave. Somewhere between that diner booth and the safety of their apartment, Sarah Mitchell and David Romano entered a void that would consume them completely. Their red Camry would never be found in any ditch or lake. Their bodies would never surface in the woods surrounding Duluth. They simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only questions that would torment everyone who loved them. The first thing Jessica Mitchell noticed, when she climbed the stairs to her sister's apartment at 10:30 the following morning, was the silence. It hung in the hallway like a physical presence, thick and wrong in a way that made her pause with her hand halfway to the door. Jessica had driven 45 minutes from Grand Rapids specifically to take Sarah shopping for winter clothes, a sisterly tradition they had maintained since their mother's death 3 years earlier. Sarah was never late, never forgot their plans, never failed to answer her phone when Jessica called the night before to confirm. If you've ever had that moment when you know something is terribly wrong before you have any proof, you understand what Jessica was feeling. Stay with us as we uncover how quickly a perfect life can become a perfect mystery. The spare key was exactly where Sarah always kept it, tucked behind the loose brick beside the mailboxes. Jessica had used it only twice before, both times during emergencies, and her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it in the lock. The apartment door opened onto a scene that looked perfectly normal at first glance, which somehow made it more disturbing. The candy bowls remained exactly where Sarah had arranged them, untouched and still full. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen counter, a perfect ring of lipstick on the rim, as if Sarah had simply stepped away for a moment. But the coffee was stone cold, and Sarah's purse was missing from its usual spot on the small table by the entrance. Jessica found herself moving through the apartment like a sleepwalker, touching familiar objects as if they might provide answers. The bed was made with military precision, the way Sarah had learned from their father during his brief stint in the army. Her jewelry box sat open on the dresser, but nothing appeared to be missing. In the bathroom, 2 toothbrushes stood side by side in the ceramic holder, a mundane detail that struck Jessica as profoundly sad. The most unsettling discovery came when Jessica checked the closet. Sarah's favorite leather boots, the ones she wore everywhere during fall and winter, remained neatly paired on the closet floor. But David's work boots, the heavy steel-toed ones he wore to the paper mill, were missing from their usual spot beside the door. His jacket was gone too, along with his wallet and keys. Small absences that painted a picture Jessica didn't want to acknowledge. Had they left together willingly, or had someone forced them to leave? The apartment showed no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or broken glass. She called the police at 11:47, her voice surprisingly steady as she explained the situation to the desk sergeant. The officer who arrived 20 minutes later was young, probably fresh out of the academy, and he moved through the apartment with methodical precision. He asked the right questions, took notes in a small spiral notebook, but Jessica could see in his eyes that he had already categorized this as routine. Sometimes couples do this, he explained, his tone gentle but dismissive. Especially new couples. They get caught up in the romance, decide to drive to the Twin Cities for the weekend. But Jessica knew her sister. Sarah called when she was going to be 15 minutes late for lunch. Sarah left detailed notes about where she kept spare keys when she went out of town for a single night. Sarah had never, not once in her 26 years, disappeared without explanation. The next 24 hours passed in a haze of phone calls and growing dread. Jessica contacted David's supervisor at the paper mill, who confirmed that he hadn't shown up for his Monday morning shift and hadn't called in sick. She reached out to their few mutual friends in Duluth, all of whom expressed genuine surprise and concern. She even called David's ex-girlfriend in Chicago, swallowing her pride and awkwardness to ask if he had mentioned any plans to leave town. The answer was always the same: no one had heard anything. No one expected them to vanish. No one could offer any explanation for where they might have gone. By November 2nd, when Jessica walked into the Duluth police station clutching a manila folder filled with photographs and handwritten notes she had compiled during her own amateur investigation, the case had officially become a missing persons inquiry. But missing persons cases in small cities like Duluth were often resolved quickly. People turned up embarrassed, explaining that they had needed time to think or had decided to start fresh somewhere else. The assumption was that Sarah and David would call within a few days, apologetic about the worry they had caused. That call never came. Instead, their disappearance became the first thread in a mystery that would unravel slowly over nearly 3 decades, revealing secrets that would shock everyone who thought they knew this quiet Minnesota community. Detective Raymond Walsh had been working missing persons cases in Duluth for 17 years when Jessica Mitchell walked into his office, and he could usually tell within the first 48 hours whether someone was genuinely missing or simply exercising their right to disappear. Walsh was a methodical man, built thick and solid like the iron ore freighters that moved through Duluth's harbor. His graying hair and weathered face suggested he had seen enough human tragedy to last several lifetimes. He listened to Jessica's concerns with patient attention, but internally he was already categorizing this as another case of young adults who had decided to start fresh. It happened more often than people wanted to believe, especially in small cities like Duluth where opportunities felt limited and winter could stretch on forever. Young couples got restless, scraped together enough money for gas, and drove toward bigger cities where they could reinvent themselves. But Detective Walsh was about to discover that some cases refused to follow the expected patterns. If you want to see how a routine investigation becomes a decades-long obsession, make sure you're subscribed because this story is just getting started. The investigation began with standard procedure. Walsh and his partner Detective Susan Martinez spent 3 days canvassing the neighborhood around Sarah's apartment, knocking on doors and asking the same questions over and over. Mrs. Dorothy Henley repeated her story about hearing laughter in the parking lot. Jimmy Kowalski described the couple driving past his house with Sarah's window down, her hair blowing in the evening breeze. A convenience store clerk on London Road thought he might have seen David's red Camry around 9 that Halloween night, but couldn't be certain. The most promising lead came from Benny's Diner, a 24-hour establishment that served as an unofficial gathering place for night shift workers and insomniacs. Rita Sorensen, a waitress working the Halloween evening shift, remembered serving coffee to a young couple who matched Sarah and David's description sometime around 8:30. She recalled the woman ordering apple pie, and the man drinking his coffee black, but couldn't remember seeing them leave or which direction they had headed afterward. More importantly, she couldn't say with absolute certainty that the couple had been Sarah and David, rather than 2 other young people celebrating Halloween. Walsh expanded the search to include local hospitals and morgues within a 100-mile radius, checking for any Jane or John Does who might match their descriptions. He contacted the state patrol to add the Camry's license plate number to their database of vehicles to watch for. He even reached out to police departments in Minneapolis and St. Paul, thinking the couple might have decided to disappear into the anonymity of the Twin Cities. Every avenue led nowhere. The red Toyota Camry seemed to have vanished as completely as its occupants. What troubled Walsh most was the complete absence of any paper trail. David hadn't used his credit card since October 30th. Sarah hadn't accessed her bank account or made any withdrawals. Neither had called in sick to work or contacted family members with explanations. In an era before cell phones and GPS tracking, people could disappear more easily. But they still needed money for gas and food. They still left traces when they used credit cards or stayed in motels. Sarah and David had left no such traces, as if they had simply evaporated. By December, the case had been relegated to a single filing cabinet in Walsh's office, just another folder among dozens of cold cases. But Walsh couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something obvious, some detail that would unlock the entire mystery. He began making his own unofficial visits to Benny's Diner, sitting in different booths and studying the layout, trying to understand how 2 people could simply vanish between ordering coffee and walking out the door. He drove the route from Sarah's apartment to the diner dozens of times, looking for places where a car might have gone off the road unnoticed. Walsh interviewed Rita Sorensen 4 more times, hoping she might remember additional details about the couple she had served. He studied traffic patterns around the diner, wondering if someone might have been watching for potential victims on Halloween night. when young couples would be out after dark. The detective's wife would later say that the Mitchell Romano case changed her husband in ways she couldn't fully understand. He became obsessed with details that seemed insignificant to everyone else. He would wake up in the middle of the night with new theories about what might have happened to the young couple. Walsh's investigation files grew thicker with each passing month, filled with witness statements, timeline reconstructions, and maps marked with possible routes the couple might have taken. But for all his methodical work, he was no closer to finding Sarah and David than he had been on November 1st. The case was about to enter a phase that every detective dreads, when active investigation gives way to hope that someone somewhere will provide the missing piece that makes everything else fall into place. The disappearance of Sarah Mitchell and David Romano affected Duluth in ways that extended far beyond their immediate circle of family and friends. In a city where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, the complete vanishing of two young people challenged fundamental assumptions about safety and predictability. Mrs. Dorothy Henley developed insomnia after November 1st, lying awake listening for footsteps on the stairs above her apartment. She had lived in the same building for 12 years without ever worrying about security, but now she found herself checking locks multiple times each night and starting at every unfamiliar sound. The apartment above her remained exactly as Sarah had left it. Jessica Mitchell had taken over the lease, hoping her sister might somehow return, but she couldn't bring herself to change anything. The candy bowls still sat on the kitchen counter, now filled with dust instead of Halloween treats. Communities have their own way of processing trauma, and Duluth was about to learn how the unknown can be more terrifying than any concrete threat. If you're fascinated by how entire towns can be changed by a single unsolved mystery, you won't want to miss what happens next. Benny's Diner became an unlikely pilgrimage site for amateur investigators and curiosity seekers. Rita Sorensen found herself telling the story of the mysterious couple dozens of times each week, the details becoming more elaborate with each retelling. The booth where she thought she had served them was eventually marked with a small plaque, though no one could say with certainty that Sarah and David had ever sat there. David's supervisor at the paper mill posted his job opening after 6 weeks, but several workers complained that it felt wrong to replace him so quickly. His locker remained untouched for months, his safety helmet and work gloves waiting for someone who would never return to claim them. The red Toyota Camry became Duluth's most famous ghost car. For years afterward, residents would call police to report sightings of vehicles matching its description. None of these reports led anywhere, but they demonstrated how deeply the case had embedded itself in the community's collective consciousness. Sarah's co-workers at the Duluth Public Library created a memorial display that remained in place for 3 years, featuring photos from her college graduation and testimonials from patrons who remembered her helpful nature and infectious smile. Children's story time was never quite the same without her animated readings. The Halloween season became permanently associated with loss in ways that affected the entire community. Trick-or-treat participation dropped significantly in the neighborhoods around East Superior Street. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam freely after dark began imposing strict curfews and supervision requirements. Local businesses installed security cameras and improved lighting in response to residents' growing anxiety about safety. The common assumption was that Sarah and David had been victims of random violence, which meant that any couple could potentially face the same fate. Jessica Mitchell's search efforts became a community institution. She organized annual awareness events, distributed missing person flyers, and maintained a tip hotline that she paid for personally. Her dedication inspired others to volunteer their time and resources, creating an informal network of people committed to finding answers. The case also attracted attention from outside Duluth. True crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators began visiting the city, hoping to solve the mystery that had stumped local police. Their presence was both welcome and frustrating, bringing fresh perspectives but also turning genuine tragedy into entertainment. Detective Walsh found himself fielding calls from psychics, conspiracy theorists, and self-appointed experts who claimed to have insights into what had happened to the missing couple. Most of these tips were useless, but he investigated every one with the same methodical approach he brought to all aspects of the case. The Duluth Herald began running anniversary articles each October 31st, keeping the case in public consciousness even as other news cycles moved on. These articles generated new tips and renewed interest, but also served as annual reminders of the community's collective failure to protect two of its own. Perhaps most significantly, the case changed how Duluth residents related to each other. The easy trust that had characterized small city life was replaced by a subtle wariness. Neighbors who had once left doors unlocked began installing security systems. Young couples became more cautious about their evening activities. The Mitchell Romano disappearance had become more than just a missing persons case. It was a wound in the community's sense of itself, a reminder that terrible things could happen to ordinary people in places that were supposed to be safe. That wound would continue to fester for decades, waiting for the truth that would finally allow it to heal. By the second anniversary of their disappearance, Sarah Mitchell and David Romano had joined the ranks of Duluth's permanent mysteries. Detective Walsh had exhausted every conventional investigative approach, following hundreds of tips that led nowhere and pursuing theories that dissolved under scrutiny. The case files now filled 3 complete filing cabinets in the police department's basement storage area. Witness statements, timeline reconstructions, search reports, and correspondence with other law enforcement agencies created a paper monument to 2 lives that had simply ended without explanation. Walsh had interviewed everyone who had known the couple, traced their movements backward from Halloween night through the entire previous month, and constructed detailed psychological profiles that might explain why they would choose to disappear voluntarily. Nothing fit the pattern of 2 responsible adults who had simply decided to start fresh. Cold cases have their own terrible rhythm, cycling between periods of intense activity and long stretches of waiting. If you've ever wondered how investigators maintain hope when every lead goes nowhere, you're about to understand the psychology of the long search. The technology available in the mid-1990s was primitive compared to what would become standard just a decade later. There were no cell phone records to analyze, no social media accounts to examine, no Jeep's data to reconstruct their final movements. The investigation relied on witness memory, physical evidence, and detective intuition. Walsh began approaching the case differently, focusing on what hadn't happened rather than what had. Sarah and David hadn't used credit cards, hadn't contacted family members, hadn't left any indication of where they were going or why they were leaving. This suggested either meticulous planning or something far more sinister. The detective started studying similar cases from other jurisdictions, looking for patterns that might connect Sarah and David's disappearance to other unsolved mysteries. He discovered several cases involving young couples who had vanished without trace, but none shared enough specific details to suggest a connection. One possibility that haunted Walsh was that the couple had encountered someone at Benny's diner who had followed them or convinced them to go somewhere isolated. The diner's location made it a natural stopping point for travelers passing through Duluth, including people who might prey on young couples. He began maintaining surveillance of the diner on Halloween nights, hoping that if their disappearance was connected to someone who targeted couples on that specific date, the perpetrator might return to the same hunting ground. These vigils continued for 5 years without producing any useful leads. Jessica Mitchell's search efforts evolved from desperate hope to grim determination. She hired private investigators with her inheritance money, funded search efforts in remote areas around Duluth, and traveled to other cities following tips from people who claimed to have seen her sister and David. Each trip ended in disappointment. The couple spotted in Seattle turned out to be strangers who happened to match general physical descriptions. The tip about 2 people living under assumed names in Denver led to a pair of elderly siblings who had lived there for decades. The private investigators provided detailed reports that consumed thousands of dollars but produced no concrete results. They confirmed what police had already discovered. That Sarah and David had simply vanished more completely than seemed possible in the modern world. Walsh's obsession with the case began to affect his health and his marriage. He worked overtime without compensation, pursuing leads on his own time and spending his personal money on long-distance phone calls to police departments across the country. His wife begged him to request a transfer to a different division. The detective began keeping duplicate files at home, studying case materials late into the night and developing increasingly elaborate theories about what might have happened. He constructed timelines that accounted for every minute of October 31, 1995, looking for gaps where someone could have intercepted the couple. By 2000, Walsh had unofficially interviewed over 300 people in connection with the case: waitresses, gas station attendants, hotel clerks, and anyone else who might have encountered two young people matching Sarah and David's descriptions during the first week of November 1995. The case had become his personal crusade, the puzzle that would define his career regardless of whether he ever solved it. Walsh's colleagues respected his dedication but worried about his mental state. Missing persons cases were supposed to be resolved quickly or transferred to cold case status. Instead, Walsh had created his own category for the Mitchell Romano disappearance, treating it as an active investigation that happened to lack recent developments. He maintained contact with dozens of law enforcement agencies, hoping that someday, somewhere, evidence would surface that would finally explain what had happened to two young people who had simply wanted to take a walk on Halloween night. The case was about to enter its longest dormant period, years when no new leads emerged and hope became increasingly difficult to maintain. The years between 2000 and 2010 brought technological advances that should have revolutionized cold case investigations, but the Mitchell-Romano disappearance remained stubbornly resistant to new techniques. Data analysis, cell phone tracking, and internet databases created possibilities that hadn't existed in 1995, but they required evidence that simply didn't exist. Detective Walsh, now in his 50s and dealing with diabetes and high blood pressure that his doctor attributed to chronic stress, continued to treat the case as his personal responsibility. He had survived 3 attempts by department administrators to reassign him to other divisions, arguing successfully that his institutional knowledge made him irreplaceable. The detective had become Duluth's unofficial expert on missing persons cases, consulted by other jurisdictions when they encountered similar mysteries. His reputation extended beyond Minnesota, and he regularly received calls from investigators who hoped his experience might help them understand their own unsolved disappearances. Some cases become more than investigations, they become lifelong commitments that define everyone touched by the mystery. If you want to understand the psychology of investigators who never give up, stay with us as we explore the human cost of the long search. Jessica Mitchell had relocated to Duluth permanently in 2003, taking early retirement from her teaching job in Grand Rapids to dedicate herself entirely to finding her sister. She lived in Sarah's apartment, surrounded by memories and evidence that she organized with the methodical precision of a professional investigator. Her dining room table had become a command center covered with maps, photographs, and correspondence with law enforcement agencies across the country. She maintained databases tracking similar disappearances, hoping to identify patterns that might connect Sarah and David's case to other unsolved mysteries. The internet had transformed Jessica's search capabilities, allowing her to network with other families of missing persons and access information that would have been impossible to obtain in 1995. She operated websites dedicated to the case, posted regularly on message boards, and corresponded with amateur investigators from around the world. Each technological advance brought renewed hope followed by familiar disappointment. Security cameras became more common throughout Duluth, but none had captured images of the couple on Halloween night 1995. Credit card tracking became more sophisticated, but Sarah and David had left no electronic trail to follow. GPS technology made it easier to search remote areas systematically, and Jessica funded several expeditions to comb through forests and abandoned properties where bodies might have been concealed. ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and volunteer search teams examined hundreds of locations without finding any trace of the missing couple. The case attracted attention from television producers who featured it on several true crime programs. These shows generated thousands of tips from viewers who thought they might have information, but none proved credible. The exposure did help maintain public awareness, ensuring that Sarah and David's faces remained familiar to Duluth residents. Social media created new possibilities for spreading information about the case, but it also attracted conspiracy theorists and attention seekers who contaminated legitimate tips with false claims and elaborate fantasies. Jessica and Detective Walsh spent considerable time investigating leads that proved to be hoaxes or misunderstandings. The most promising development came in 2007, when construction workers renovating the basement of an abandoned building near Benny's Diner discovered what appeared to be personal belongings that might have belonged to a young couple. The items included a woman's earring and a man's watch, but forensic analysis proved they were unrelated to Sarah and David. Walsh began collaborating with cold case investigators from other states, sharing information about techniques and theories that might apply to long-term missing persons cases. He attended conferences, participated in training programs, and studied advances in forensic psychology that might provide new insights. The detective developed expertise in analyzing the behavior patterns of people who disappear voluntarily versus those who become victims of foul play. Everything about Sarah and David's case suggested they had not chosen to vanish, but the complete absence of physical evidence made it impossible to prove what had actually happened to them. By 2008, Walsh had unofficially become Duluth's cold case specialist, inheriting responsibility for dozens of unsolved mysteries that had accumulated over the decades. But the Mitchell Romano disappearance remained his primary obsession, the case that had defined his career and consumed his personal life. His marriage had ended in 2006, with his ex-wife citing his inability to separate his work from his personal relationships. Walsh's adult children worried about his health and his isolation, but understood that the search for Sarah and David had become more than just a professional obligation. The detective was approaching retirement age, facing the possibility that he might never learn what had happened to the young couple whose disappearance had haunted him for over a decade. But advances in forensic technology were about to provide new tools that would finally unlock the mystery that had seemed unsolvable. In March 2023, 27 years after Sarah Mitchell and David Romano vanished from Duluth, a routine construction project would finally provide the breakthrough that Detective Walsh had been waiting for his entire career. The renovation of Benny's Diner had been delayed for months due to permit issues, but when workers finally began tearing up the old basement floor, they discovered something that would change everything. Buried beneath concrete that had been poured sometime in the mid-1990s, workers found a small storage room that didn't appear on any building plans. The room contained items that had been carefully preserved in plastic containers, including personal belongings that matched descriptions of things Sarah and David had been carrying on Halloween night 1995. Detective Lisa Chen, who had inherited the cold case division when Walsh retired in 2015, was called to examine the discovery. Chen had studied the Mitchell-Romano case extensively, reviewing Walsh's meticulous files and continuing his methodical approach to the investigation. After nearly 3 decades of searching, the truth was literally buried beneath a place where hundreds of people had walked every day. If you want to see how modern forensic science finally solved Duluth's most famous mystery, make sure you're subscribed because the resolution will shock you. The hidden room also contained human remains that forensic analysis would eventually identify as belonging to Sarah and David. The condition of the remains and the manner in which they had been concealed suggested that their deaths had occurred shortly after their disappearance, probably within hours of their last confirmed sighting. More importantly, the room contained evidence that pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the diner's layout and access to construction equipment. The concrete work had been professional quality, suggesting that whoever had created this hidden grave possessed both the skills and the opportunity to permanently conceal evidence of murder. Chen's investigation focused on identifying everyone who had been involved in renovations or maintenance work at Benny's Diner during the months following the couple's disappearance. Building permits from late 1995 showed that extensive basement work had been completed in December, supposedly to repair water damage from a burst pipe. The permit had been filed by Marcus Webb, a local contractor who had been responsible for numerous renovation projects throughout Duluth during the 1990s. Webb had died in 2012, but his business records were still maintained by his son, who cooperated fully with the investigation. Those records revealed that Webb had worked alone on the Benny's Diner project, which was unusual for basement renovation work that typically required multiple workers. More suspiciously, Webb had ordered significantly more concrete than would have been necessary for the repairs described in his permit application. Chen discovered that Webb had been a regular customer at Benny's Diner for years before the renovation project, often eating there after finishing construction jobs around the city. The diner's staff in 1995 remembered him as friendly but somewhat intrusive, someone who asked personal questions and seemed to pay unusual attention to young couples. Advanced forensic analysis of evidence from the hidden room revealed DNA that matched samples obtained from Webb's medical records during his treatment for cancer in 2011. The evidence was conclusive, proving that he had been present in the room where Sarah and David's bodies had been concealed. Reconstruction of events suggested that Webb had encountered the couple at Benny's Diner on Halloween night, possibly offering them assistance with car trouble or directions to a local attraction. His familiarity with the area and his appearance as a trustworthy local businessman would have made Sarah and David comfortable accepting help from him. Webb had then led them to a secluded location where he killed them, probably in his truck or at a remote construction site where their screams wouldn't be heard. He had transported their bodies back to the diner during the early morning hours when the restaurant was closed, concealing them in the basement before beginning his renovation work. The contractor had spent weeks carefully constructing the hidden room, working during off hours when no one else was present. His reputation for quality work and attention to detail had served him well in creating a nearly perfect hiding place that had concealed evidence of double murder for over 27 years. Chen's investigation also revealed that Webb had been questioned briefly during the original missing persons investigation, but Detective Walsh had cleared him quickly based on his seemingly solid alibi and his reputation as a respected community member. The contractor had even participated in volunteer search efforts, helping to look for victims he had already killed. The psychological profile that emerged showed Webb as a predator who had used his professional skills and community standing to hunt victims over an extended period. Sarah and David had been unlucky enough to encounter him on a night when circumstances aligned perfectly for him to act on violent impulses he had probably been suppressing for years. The case that had consumed Detective Walsh's career was finally solved, but the resolution brought both closure and tragic irony. The answer had been literally beneath everyone's feet for decades, hidden by someone the community had trusted completely. The news that Sarah Mitchell and David Romano had been found, and that their killer had been identified, spread through Duluth with the kind of shock that comes when long-held mysteries are suddenly resolved. Detective Lisa Chen held a press conference on April 15, 2023, nearly 28 years after the couple had vanished, to announce that the case was officially closed. Jessica Mitchell, now 61 and having spent most of her adult life searching for her sister, sat in the front row as Chen explained how advanced forensic techniques had finally revealed the truth that had hidden beneath Benny's Diner for nearly 3 decades. The resolution brought both relief and a profound sadness that Sarah and David had been so close all along. The community's reaction was complex, mixing satisfaction that the mystery had been solved with horror at discovering that Marcus Webb, a man who had lived among them for decades after committing murder, had been trusted and respected until his death. Residents realized they had probably interacted with him countless times, never suspecting his terrible secret. Some mysteries take decades to solve, but when the truth finally emerges, it changes everything we thought we knew about safety, trust, and the people who live among us. If this case has affected you, please share your thoughts in the comments and consider subscribing for more investigations into the cold cases that refuse to stay buried. Detective Walsh, now 73 and living in a nursing facility due to complications from diabetes, was informed of the breakthrough by Chen personally. The news brought him to tears, not just because the case was solved, but because the resolution vindicated his belief that Sarah and David had been victims of foul play rather than voluntary disappearance. Walsh's decades of meticulous investigation had created the foundation that made Chen's breakthrough possible. His comprehensive files, witness interviews, and timeline reconstructions provided the framework that allowed modern forensic techniques to finally identify Webb as the killer. The closure brought unexpected peace to the detective who had sacrificed his health and personal life to search for two people he had never known personally. His dedication had ensured that Sarah and David were never forgotten, that their case remained active even when leads seemed to disappear entirely. Benny's Diner was permanently closed following the discovery, the building too associated with tragedy for any business to operate successfully there. The site was eventually converted into a small memorial park dedicated to Sarah and David, with plaques describing their lives and the long search that had finally brought them justice. Jessica Mitchell used the settlement money from Webb's estate to establish a foundation supporting families of missing persons, providing resources for private investigations and advanced forensic analysis that many families couldn't afford. Her experience had taught her that police departments, despite their best efforts, often lacked the specialized tools needed for complex disappearance cases. The Mitchell Romano Foundation became a model for how families could support each other through the unique trauma of having loved ones vanish without explanation. Jessica's expertise, gained through nearly 3 decades of searching, helped other families navigate law enforcement bureaucracy and maintain hope during impossible circumstances. The case also led to changes in how Duluth police approached missing persons investigations, particularly those involving young adults. New protocols required more extensive background checks on potential witnesses and more thorough examination of crime scenes, even when no obvious evidence of foul play existed. Advanced forensic techniques that had been crucial to solving the case were integrated into standard investigative procedures, ensuring that future mysteries might be resolved more quickly. The technology that had finally identified Webb as the killer was now routinely applied to cold cases throughout Minnesota. The psychological impact on Duluth was profound and lasting. Residents who had lived with the mystery for decades suddenly had to confront the reality that a killer had walked among them for years after committing murder. Webb had been a neighbor, a contractor who had worked on their homes, someone they had trusted with access to their most private spaces. The case became a cautionary tale about how predators could hide behind facades of respectability and community involvement. Webb had volunteered for search efforts, attended community meetings about safety, and presented himself as someone concerned about protecting others from the kind of violence he had personally committed. For Sarah and David's friends and family, the resolution brought complex emotions. Relief that the uncertainty was finally over mixed with grief for lives that had been cut short, just as they were beginning to build something beautiful together. The couple would be remembered not just as victims, but as people who had loved each other and had dreams for their future. Their story became a testament to the power of persistence, demonstrating that even the most carefully concealed crimes could eventually be exposed through dedication, advancing technology, and the refusal of people like Detective Walsh and Jessica Mitchell to give up hope. The cold case that had haunted Duluth for 28 years was finally closed, but its impact would continue to shape the community's understanding of justice, memory, and the price of never forgetting those who vanish into the darkness.